Welcome back to another week. Let's discuss with Meg Duke, where we talk about some things perinatal and all things mental health. This week, I am so excited. I have stalked somebody again on Instagram because I read their book and I was very excited about it. So, Chelsea is a health and science journalist, mother brain, how neuroscience is rewriting. Mother brain. It's happening already. Rewriting the Story of Parenthood is her first book out from Henry Holt and Company. It was supported by a grant from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation Program for the Public Understanding of Science, Technology, and Economics. Chelsea lives in Maine with her husband and two kids. Everybody, please welcome Chelsea.
Thank
Hello.
you for having me, Meg. I'm so glad to be with you.
Such a pleasure. And what I just loved reading that about being sponsored by a science foundation, science, technology, and economics, and how important that is to improve public understanding of that.
Yes. Yeah. It was it's an important grant, and I was really glad to have that support for this project. It was a good, I think, endorsement of like the need for this kind of book.
Absolutely. Yes. So I'll just jump right in. How did you get into journalism?
Yeah, I started college as a pre-med major and then kind of quickly realized that I loved to write and that was really where my heart was. And I fortunately was at a school that had a very good journalism program, and I switched majors and sort of instantly realized that's where I was supposed to be. And so I studied journalism in college, and then got up my first newspaper job in the fall after I graduated at the Concord Monitor, which is a small but really sort of well-known newspaper in New Hampshire that has been known for both its political coverage and also its narrative storytelling. And that's where I found my passion really for storytelling. And so I worked for newspapers for for the next 15 years or so, and then eventually was an editor here at the newspaper in Maine near where I live. And I left that job in 2017 after my second son was born to be a freelancer and eventually to write this book.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yes, absolutely. And I love that too with the narrative storytelling. There's a type of a modality of therapy called narrative therapy.
Yeah.
And I'm not an expert in it, but I do love the opportunity to let somebody kind of tell their story and
Yeah.
kind of approach the interactions that way. So that's really lovely. What a
Yeah.
great story. And gosh, so you've been all over New England. That sounds just the most beautiful place.
Oh yeah, yes, yeah. I worked in New Hampshire and in Philadelphia and Boston and Maine. That's
Oh my gosh, amazing. Yes. Maine is on my bucket list. I would love to go.
yeah,
Sounds
yeah,
lovely. Maybe a little
beautiful.
cold. Maybe in
Yeah,
February, maybe a little cold.
yeah. It just don't come in March and April.
Fair enough.
Every other time is beautiful.
Fair enough. I love it. So tell me what really sparked the idea to write the book Mother Brain?
I mean, it came from my own struggle in my early postpartum period. I really was my first son was born in 2015, and he was on the small side, and I was just really overwhelmed with worry and worried not just about his growth and well-being and my own capacity to be a mom, but also worried about the worry itself, and went looking for answers that, the words that could kind of help me to put my own experience into context, and really started looking at the research of maternal anxiety. And that led me to this kind of broader idea that the brain changes in pregnancy in the postpartum period, and not just for the 1 in 5 people who experience postpartum mood and anxiety disorders, but for everyone. And I found a lot of reassurance in the science of the parental brain, and it led me to this question of, why aren't we talking about this? Why isn't it part of prenatal education and the broader cultural conversation about what it means to be a parent? And in 2018, I wrote a magazine story on that topic for the Boston Globe. And that was really about the maternal brain science specifically and my own experience. And it went viral. It really got a huge readership and a huge response from people And I had already been thinking about possibly writing a book, but that really convinced me that people need this information and there's an audience for it, and I should put my focus there.
Wow, amazing. Yeah, that's wonderful. That article in the Boston Globe was kind of like, here is your side. If you were thinking about doing it, here it is.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it was like proof of concept in a sense that, like, it's so scary to put it out there to not really know, my own like personal struggle, how much people would relate to it, and they did. And it was pretty overwhelming and really gratifying, and also enraging in the sense that, I was already mad that, like, how I felt like I had sort of been failed by not having this information, and turns out there's lots of other people who are mad too.
Absolutely. Well, and in your book, you quote Schmidt and talking about kind of the distinct developmental stage with long lasting effects. And I don't think people really consider, like, oh, you're pregnant. Oh, you've popped the baby out. You're done. It's almost like a medical model of, like, your ankle was broken and now your ankle's not broken, so you're fine. But also, we do rehab, we do physical therapy, we do things for people when they have a fracture or something.
Yeah.
I don't feel like there's been a real awareness of, like, that matrescence, right? Where it's a new stage. I loved reading about that in your book.
Yeah. I mean, there's a complete care cliff that happens at childbirth. We're really intensely, tracked and studied, and we have so many doctor's appointments to go to in those final months of pregnancy. And then our baby's born and we go home and we have 1 6-week appointment. That's standard. And other than that, it's a complete wasteland of care. And that's not how it is in our peer countries. There's much more holistic and continuing care, and an emphasis not only on in-office doctor's appointments, but also home care, visiting nurses and midwives. And that just doesn't happen here in any standardized way. If you're lucky, if you get that, and you have to seek it out yourself and have the resources to do it. Typically, it's often not covered by insurance, or not accessible in other ways. You mentioned matrescence. That's an idea that was created by Dana Raphael, a few decades ago, and has been repopularized now by a few people, including Dr. Aurelie Athan, who is at Columbia Teachers College. And I just did an event with her recently, and I think her thinking is really so powerful and was really influential to me with this book. I mean, I think that's really like the central argument of this book, that this is a developmental stage of life that is beginning that pregnancy is the beginning of it, but it continues. This time of, like, upheaval and turmoil really continues long into the postpartum period. And we need to think about that for all parents, not just for gestational parents, about how do we support that process in a meaningful way. And also then, like, who does it make us into? Who do we become through it?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I'm lucky to be connected with people in different countries and talking about their postpartum care. And I've had a couple of guests on this show, even in the Kansas City area, physical therapy and chiropractic and different places, and not just in Kansas City, but where they will come into the home and they will make sure that you're supported. And also comes from quite a place of privilege to be able to access some of those things, because it's just not a standard of care. It's not expected. Our insurance doesn't cover a lot of it here in the United States. And it's wild. I'm sure you've heard of the expression, I think somebody mentioned it on my show before, about, like, the mom is seen as like a candy wrapper. And so, and then after the baby comes out, we throw the wrapper away. Discard it. Yeah. And it reflecting back, I think, on my own experience as well, I did feel kind of discarded, luckily not by those closest to me, but certainly professionally. It was, how's the baby? And I was like, no one really cared kind of how I was doing, apart from how are your nipples so you can feed the baby. It wasn't even that question wasn't necessarily about
you.
just as a vehicle to continue to support the baby. So yeah, I definitely appreciate that for sure.
And I think there's such a lack of talking about how, when we're pregnant, we are, vehicles for this baby, and our care is so oriented in that way that we're not often given time to really like reflect on how it's affecting our inner lives and like our mental states. And I think that's something that this science, that's really important about this science is, people who do that reflection. There's lots of different ways that you can like think about new motherhood, different frameworks, whether you're like looking at it from like a feminist perspective or a spiritual perspective, or whatever kind of schema you bring to the role. This science is, I had an OBGYN tell me recently, someone who's sort of, I would say, probably skeptical of this book and of this way of thinking, make this point, that like there's lots of ways to look at how, how the time of becoming a parent, and this science is really just one of them. And I can respect that point of view, but at the same time, this like physiological transformation is not optional. Like it is what we go through. It is the neurobiological adaptation that helps us move into this role. And it really, no matter what your view is, how you're thinking about your motherhood, I think that this science can inform it and like help you to understand yourself better. And so, in the book, I like write about the meaning that I took from the science, but I think people can take other meanings from it. But but we need to have the information in order to do that.
Absolutely. Yes. It's out there for us to consume and try to interpret in ways that are meaningful. Right. I understand that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I do apologize to everybody, mostly you, because I'm such a fangirl in this moment. I'm trying to be cool, but I'm just like quoting lines from your book. So hopefully that's not too annoying, but I loved where you talked about male research were pathologizing their normal biological processes, and postpartum concerns were seen as soft quality of life issues rather than real public health concerns. And I felt seen and validated and smacked across the face in a good way, right? I was like, someone's saying it. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that was sort of talking about I think that was I wrote that in a relation to my conversation with Peter Schmidt, who's chief neuroendocrinologist at NIH. I think that's his correct title. You might want to fact check me on that. He is someone who's worked in maternal mental health for a long time, and he was really talking about like how hard it's been to study this over the years, because women were so by necessity skeptical of researchers coming and investigating these processes in their lives, because they had been done wrong for so long. And so people who were trying to do good work in this area had a hard time with access to the people who they were studying, essentially. And then at the same time, there were male researchers who were pathologizing normal biological processes. And so like the women were rightly skeptical. And I think that to some degree exists today too. There's really, where I think the research around sex and gender is in such an interesting place here of some researchers really trying to push the bounds of our understanding of those things and as it relates to gender norms, and including within the context of parenthood. And then there are some researchers who are really kind of doubling down on those norms too, and using sometimes the same science to do something very differently politically and socially.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. I found that to be so interesting. And yeah, I can imagine what that must have been like for someone to be like, hi, I'm a man and I'm a scientist and I would like to come and
right. Yeah. And I think a lot of the progress that we see in the field today is from women coming into the field and bringing their own stories and their own questions to the work.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I did like that how you talked also about kind of baby blues and postpartum depression, and how you saw postpartum depression as like you thought of it as kind of like the flu. Like I test positive for the flu, I test negative for the flu. I test positive for postpartum, I test negative for it. And I liked how who was it? It was Meltzer Brody was saying that it's a garbage bag term.
Yeah.
I thought that was such a fabulous way of describing that, because I have to admit for myself, when I was reading about the cancer, how they described that for cancer, I was like, oh yeah, I guess I really did think cancer was just kind of cancer, and obviously like breast cancer, but there are so many types, and
Right.
postpartum, there's this real spectrum, and I think that language can be so important when we're using that versus
Yeah.
just, the slapping a label on something.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, I don't know a single person who has found their way to parenthood who hasn't experienced some really significant psychological distress, whether it's from, struggling with fertility or pregnancy loss or complicated pregnancies, traumatic childbirth, trying to breastfeed and having a hard time, or not, and feeling the social pressures around that, just
Mhm.
postpartum in general, and then going back to work. It's such a process, such a time of life that's full of struggle, and that I argue in the book that like that's like an inherent part of it.
Mhm.
So yet we're like presented with this list, this like checklist that sort of
Mhm.
implies that you either have postpartum depression or you're healthy and stable.
Yes.
And I I I now like really reject that idea, which is not to say that the checklist or the screening tools aren't important to some
Right.
degree. It's just that it doesn't capture the whole reality.
Yeah.
And it also sends like a false message, I think, to people that um, that struggle is entirely pathological, right? Like, and where it actually is very normal in this time. And so is needing extra support.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it is helpful to be able to have diagnoses, to be able to have kind of standardized evidence-based, certainly treatment practices available. I do, when I have new clients who are in a perinatal space, give them a postpartum space through the Edinburgh. We definitely talk about, it's nice to have the criteria, and also that's just kind of a nice little guide. It's not the end all be all. And
Right.
I think too, that's something that I've had a lot of people talk to me about in social media or personally, and then certainly obviously in my practice, about I don't I don't deserve your time as a therapist. I don't have enough the trauma Olympics is what I like to call it. Like
Right. Right.
I'm not meddling in the trauma Olympics, so don't let me waste your time. And it's like, you don't have to check all of these boxes to have had a significant physiological change impact your life just because you're not as bad as somebody else, which again, I want to use really
Sure.
big air quotes on that.
Right. Right.
And so I think it is very dangerous when we do kind of restrict it in that way, for
And
sure.
there's such stakes for women around saying that they need help too, especially if you're talking about Black and brown women who, are the risks are even greater if they
Yes.
admit to struggling as a mother,
Yes.
and that the ideals that we put around motherhood and the lines that we draw between good and bad mothers. I mean, it amplifies it even more. It makes it even harder
Yes.
to say when you're having a hard time, even though again, it's like an entirely normal thing to struggle and to need help.
Yes. Yeah, I think the especially with COVID, and quarantine, for those of us who did that to whatever extent, and that kind of the village being gone, the expression, it takes a village. And for whatever reason, for my examples that I left Houston on St. Patrick's Day of 2020 and moved to Kansas City, and asked me how well I've done at making new friends in a strange city during a pandemic. So, but just generally other reasons for different things, that people feel isolated or that they have to keep things to themselves. That I'm not supposed to struggle. I'm supposed to be a mom, and I should
Right.
know this. And naturally, it's a
Right.
natural
Right.
thing as a woman
Right. Like, I mean, it's a idea that I spend a lot of time on in the book, the idea of maternal instinct, that it is something that comes online once we're mothers, and, is this innate and automatic capacity for caregiving that is part of our womanhood. And also that idea is grounded in science, and none of those things are true.
Right. And I think one of the things I like to talk about as well is you don't have to, it doesn't have to come to you naturally while you're pregnant. The moment you see your baby, like that connection doesn't always occur right then. And I think that really scares I know that really scares a lot of people, because we're fed this line that we're just naturally, innately supposed to understand how these things work. And being open and flexible to learning and developing and evolving, which we will continue to do until our children are in their 50s, who we continue
Right.
as parents and then grandparents and whatever. But
Yep.
yeah, I think that's something that's really helpful for more people to be able to know. It's like, hey, that's
Yeah.
not necessarily going to be within you right away.
Absolutely. It is a process. That is what it is. It's a process. And I mean, the brain really, the changes that happen in the brain are really make that really clear. I mean, when for gestational parents, when we're in that early postpartum period, what the research shows is that we're kind of pushed into this time of hyper responsiveness. The brain areas that are related to motivation and to vigilance and to meaning making are really highly active. And so we're like compelled to go to like try to meet our baby's needs, even if we don't have like the practical skills for doing so, and to go back again and again and again.
Mhm.
And it's, that's like keeping our baby alive, but it's also putting us into this really intense period of learning.
Mhm.
And over time, it's thought that what that does is it makes us better at it. It fine tunes the brain networks that are involved in social cognition and reading and responding to another person's mental state and emotions. And so we get better at that reading process, which means we're better able to change with our kids as they change and adjust our responses to them as their needs change. And that is like very fundamentally a long-term process. But we often in the social representations of motherhood, in the books that we read, in different parenting philosophies, and have this very romantic view that like it's sort of like a baby is born, you're flooded with oxytocin, you latch on naturally and easily, or the baby latches on naturally and easily, and they're flooded with oxytocin, and the bond is sealed forever. And maybe it happens that way for some people, but not for everyone. And that's okay, because it's actually, our biology accounts for that, for all different paths towards that learning process.
Absolutely. Yes. That's a great way of having that kind of helping people to understand that for sure. I loved how you also talked about in your book about identity as a mother and kind of transitioning, especially one of the things that you talked about specifically was when your identity is wrapped up in things like work, and then figuring out kind of on that spectrum and all of that in between. I'd love to talk more about kind of your discussion of that in the book.
Yeah. I mean, I think, what should I say about that? So, I think this, one thing that so I think that we have this kind of way of talking about the postpartum period that is very similar to how we talk about our bodies also in pregnancy, and like the idea of like bouncing back, right? Like your body like bouncing back.
Yes.
And I've even seen this on some social media posts, of people like trying to distill the science for a lay audience, like saying like, yeah, your brain shrinks during pregnancy and the early postpartum period, but it's thought that it bounces back by 6 months. And that's not actually true. That's not an accurate representation of the science at all. but I think there's this idea that we do that with our identities too, like that like we get back to who we were before, that's somehow the goal, to like reclaim part of ourselves. And you know, I think there's like value in seeking the things that brought us like joy and comfort and peace and a sense of ourselves before pregnancy. But I also think there's real power in like acknowledging that we are different afterward.
Yes.
And the problem has been that so long that for so long that difference has meant lesser, right? We've had this like mommy brain idea of new mothers, that they're forgetful and frazzled and can't keep up. And that is so damaging and so has been so dominant. And this neuroscience really shows something very different, which is that we develop all of these amazing new cognitive skills or heightened cognitive skills, and that we, connect with people differently, and that we have, we sort of like rise to the challenges of new parenthood, not only like logistically but like at a very fundamental level, like neurally, like we are changed by it. And I think people can take all sorts of meaning from that, but I think it's something that we need to talk more about and that needs to be studied more also.
Absolutely. Yes. I like that you said it too about I wish that there was some way we could just erase bounce back from our vernacular.
Yes.
I can't tell you especially the body image that goes with that and the stressors that people put on themselves. Your brain, absolutely. It's frustrating already sometimes when I do feel like my brain is not functioning on all limits and on all levels, and then to have somebody like, oh, there's that mom brain, and it's like,
right.
Thank you for invalidating my entire existence and life experience.
Yeah. I mean, so let's talk about that for a minute, because there are like real documented average deficits in memory during pregnancy, but it's generally thought that they are small and temporary.
Yes.
And researchers have just started looking at whether they're measuring cognitive function wrong, potentially, in the early postpartum period. Like they've mostly been applying the same kinds of cognitive tests that they use for the general population to look at the brains of mostly mothers in that time. And they've started thinking, maybe we need to like make some more parent relevant tests and see how mothers do then. And there's just been some very early work on that, but they have indicated that like actually mothers do pretty good when you like ask them to recall a list of words that are very baby related. Like they've just like shifted their focus in that time, not somehow lost capacity. And the animal research, especially in rodents, really shows that rat mothers do very well cognitively in later life. In fact, it's like very clear that rat mothers motherhood has like a neuroprotective effect on rats' brains.
Wow.
And there's some indications that might be true for humans too. There are these studies that I just love that have come out in the last few years that are using big data banks of brain imaging in the UK and in Australia, and they're comparing the brains of parents and non-parents. And these are people who are in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond. Mm-hmm. And they're finding that parents' brains are what researchers call younger looking, that like there are slowed effects of aging in their brains. And it makes sense when you think about it, because there's like parenthood involves these long-term, constantly changing cognitive challenges, which we know like that kind of engagement, especially social engagement, is really good for the brain over the long term. And so there's some thinking that parenthood, at least for some people, might be neuroprotective in humans too.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, that's fascinating. That makes sense. It's kind of like if you don't use it, you lose it kind of thing with your brain. And I do feel like my brain is consistently challenged. Maybe
Yeah.
it's not even necessarily something to, it's not linear algebra, but it's
Right.
we were to bring something for circle time that starts with the letter C on a Friday
Yeah,
morning. Like, if we,
exactly.
those are the things that I wouldn't have had to have done otherwise.
Yeah. And then as our kids get older, it becomes more complex, like figuring out who they're becoming and what they need from us as parents. And yeah, I mean, it just feels like such a counterpoint to this idea that we're compromised by motherhood.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so what are some things that you encourage people having the experience of writing this book and working with people, and then how do we amplify that story? How do we work to rewrite what it means to become a parent, to become a mother? What do we do to kind of spread the word? Obviously, start a podcast.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that like a lot of it sits in how we talk about our own experiences and how honest we are with each other about what it was like for us to become parents. I think that's I think the science can do a lot for that, and I'm hoping this book can be a part of that process. I do think that a lot of the kind of takeaways from this book are not individual actions, but societal ones, and things that we need to change at like the level of government and institutions. And if we're going to really embrace the idea that new parenthood is a developmental stage of life, then we need to look at what we're doing for young families and for postpartum people. And one big message from this book, especially when we're starting to talk about non-gestational parents, fathers, and others, is that time really matters. It's not just the hormonal and physiological experience of pregnancy that changes the brain, but it's exposure to our babies. It's time with our babies, who are these really powerful stimuli. And if we want time with our babies, we need paid time off. And we need both, all parents to have access to that. And the United States is one of 6 countries in the world that doesn't have mandated paid leave for mothers. And most of our peer countries also offer generous leave for fathers and other parents, 24 weeks or more.
Yeah.
And we've got 0. So, that's a real American shame. And then also we say, like, we need to look at clinical care and say, what can we do better? And there's a lot there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to come on. I've been looking forward to this. I read your book and was like, oh, I wonder if I can sneak into her DMs, and you were kind enough to say yes. So I really appreciate the time.
Well,
I just wanted to thank you. I was just saying, could you let the listeners know where they can find you?
Yeah. So the book you can buy anywhere you buy books, online or at your local independent bookstore. And I have a website, motherbrainbook.com, and lots of information about the book there. And also there's you can sign up for my newsletter there as well.
Amazing. Well, thank you again. I appreciate it so much. And to everybody else, be curious, not judgmental. Bye.